9. May 1945. Munich. In a small notebook salvaged from a collapsed wardrobe, Karl wrote, "We will rebuild on silence and call it peace." He could not have said it aloud. Not to the neighbors who watched each other for survival. Not to the American soldier at the corner with a list of names. Not even to his sister who grieved loudly in order to say nothing at all. He wrote it on a page he could tear out. He wrote it as a thesis for a life that would need to keep secret its own thesis. He closed the book. He stepped into the corridor and past the missing door. The hallway was open at one side, a rectangle cut by fire and air raids. Beyond it, a skyline that had lost its memory of roofs. The city was rubble. The word for it would become a proper noun. Rubble in German with a capital letter and a definite article. The rubble was red, brown, and a dusty white that once had been plaster and ornaments. In the months to come, women would climb the heaps, Trommerfrauen with scarves and crows on their shoulders. They would swing iron pry bars called kufus and work with bare hands and borrowed gloves. They would pass bricks through lines of women and boys like a long, fused wire of labor. The immediate aftermath began with an inventory of absences. A father not returning. A husband's last letter from the Odefront. A mother buried but between houses. A son in uniform without a grave. The radio station now spoke in another voice. It used English words that would take years to learn by heart. It said Kommandantur and order and curfew. In Allied occupation reports collected in the Bundesarchiv, the tone is clinical. For Munich on 2 May 1945, civilian population demoralized, water and gas irregular, tuberculosis incidence estimated rising. For the surrounding towns, no organized resistance. No organized resistance. Some sniping. For the entire zone, food stocks for 8 weeks at reduced ration, black market lightly. The mathematics of food announced itself before the mathematics of guilt. It took the form of ration cards cut into squares with little circles for stamps, a loaf reduced to grams per family per day, an egg calculated as a privilege, calories per day listed on a public board like tariffs, 1,200. Then, in the winter to come, less. The arithmetic of survival worked in kilometers and in cigarettes, 15 kilometers by bicycle for potatoes, 3 cigarettes for butter, 4 cigarettes for shoes with holes. What would become known as the hunger winter had not yet arrived. For now, there was May. There was sunlight through bombed-out walls. And there were first orders. The Americans posted a curfew. They posted a prohibition on gatherings. They posted a prohibition on carrying weapons. They posted prohibition on carrying weapons. They posted prohibitions on belonging, without yet naming the memberships. Karl picked his way to the registry office that no longer had a roof. He had worked there since 1937. It issued marriage permits and change of address notices. It sent notices to the party office when people moved. He had stamped forms with the Reich's emblem until very recently. He had filed notices of death for bombing raids. He had pre-printed phrases that were no longer to be used and yet would sit in drawers for a long time. He watched as the first American sergeant pinned a flyer on the broken doorframe. The flyer was printed in German. It announced that all civil servants must report. It announced a cessation of all activities of the party. It announced that those who had been in certain organizations would be suspended. He copied the flyer into his notebook. Then he wrote a second sentence. "We will be examined like tools for usefulness and for rust." He tore out the page and burned it in a tea tin. He left the ash when he closed the lid, a private memorial no one would ever visit. The occupation forces entered the city with lists. They had prepared them in England and in intelligence briefings. They made new lists based on denunciations and investigations. The first wave of non-fraternization orders established distance. The prohibition on smiles was unofficial but effective. Hands that reached toward each other were redirected toward work. The Americans established a headquarters in the former party building. They placed an officer in the desk of a man who had fled the city. The Germans learned to wait for permission to move at night. They learned to carry passes with red stamps. They learned to show their palms as a greeting to indicate there was no weapon. They learned that the past could be repurposed as the new language. A man who had been a party member became merely a follower. A man who had held a low office became merely a functionary. A man who had written reports became merely a functionary. A man who had written reports became merely a scribe. The diction of a defensive present tense. In August 1945, in the US zone, denazification questionnaires appeared like a weather front. The Fragebogen was long. It asked for things that would be remembered and for things that would be denied. It asked when you joined. It asked what you did. It asked what you knew. It asked what you knew. It asked whether you ever protested and to whom. It asked about affiliations and friendships. It asked about leaders and routines. It asked and it collected. Allied intelligence summaries describe rooms filled with paper inhaling the dust of the old regime. Millions of forms came in. The paper itself has a weight in the record. Karl received his own form in September. He took it home rolled like a map of a country he had not meant to visit. He stared at the boxes. He had a party membership card with a date, 1938. He had joined because the office had asked for it. He had paid dues the way one paid for coal. They had said it would be easier. They had said it would be necessary. The line between necessity and choice was thin and wrote itself later in thicker letters. In his mind, he saw the categories printed in the occupation instructions: major offender, offender, lesser offender, follower, exonerated. He did not imagine himself as the first or the second. He aimed for the fourth. He would need letters. People called them shiny Purcell certificates, laundry slang for statements testifying to cleanliness. You asked a neighbor who had credibility. You asked the man who had been in the SPD before that had been illegal. You asked the woman whose brother had been imprisoned. You asked anyone who had been harmed. You asked them to remember that you had been kind or at least not cruel or absent. He took the form back to the office. He handed it to a man in an American uniform and another man with a red armband that said German assistant. The red now meant something else, but it still meant power. He walked back through a street that did not have names anymore. It had landmarks named in rubble: the wall with the door that led to the nothing, the tree that had survived the shrapnel, the car without wheels used for storage. He made notes in his notebook, not about guilt or innocence, but about the arithmetic of October 1945. 3 nights of frost. 2 loaves obtained through an acquaintance who knew a baker. 1 rumor that the Russians in the East took everything, that the women there were not safe, that he was lucky here. Rumors ran like water but carried more debris. Meanwhile, the missing continued to be missing. The German Red Cross rebuilt its tracing service in a corner of a former school building. People pinned notes to boards. They pictured the absent when there were pictures to pin. Names and dates: last seen, last seen, last letter, last letter. The formality of these posters made grief look like administration. It was, in fact, the clerical disguise of hope. There were camps near Munich that housed displaced persons and former forced laborers. Feldafing, Landsberg. The Allied reports call them DP camps and assign them numbers like warehouses for human futures. They were places of language and swallowing. Yiddish and Polish and Ukrainian and Lithuanian and German spoken at each other and at the walls. The Americans posted guards. They allowed self-governance under supervision. They visited with clipboards. DPs had their own police in some places. They had committees and newspapers. They had a rate of calories greater than Germans because international agencies allocated it and insisted, to the resentment of many. The resentment had its own arithmetic. 3 times as many calories for them, 2 times as many for labor. The arithmetic failed to hold what it was measuring, and the locals saw and counted, and some counted against. In June 1945, the Americans forced townspeople near Dachau to visit Dachau. They filmed them watching. The newsreels showed in cinemas. People were paid to attend with ration cards. They were admonished to look. A woman covered her face. A man shook his head. The camera lingered. It recorded shock but could not record interior reordering. It could not make mathematics out of shame. It could only add pictures to memory and require that they be carried out like empty pails slowly filled later. Karl visited the camp with a group from his office. He had known Dachau as a word for a long time. He had not known it as a place to which one could be taken. The gates were open under the eyes of the authorities. The Americans gave explanations without the fury that an ordinary civilian might have expected. It was a cold tour. There were beds stacked in tiers with blankets folded by a hand for a visitor, an ironic and deliberate structural proof of what had not been offered when it had mattered. There were photographs posted by the army. They were large and had captions. The captions gave numbers, which do one kind of work. The air gave smell, which does another kind. In his notebook later, he did not write about smell. He wrote, in a line that completed the first, "We cannot say we did not see." He wrote it, and he did not show it to anyone. The winter of 1946-47 was heavy. The Allied files call it harsh and significant. The words are administrative. They cannot say cold and then they try. The Elbe froze. The Ruhr froze. The pipes under cities froze. The heat that had survived in the walls dissipated. The coal allotments were insufficient. Women burned furniture. Men burned books they did not want to sell. Children slept 2 to a bed. The wind made its own laws. The official ration in some places fell to below 1,000 calories. The British zone had fewer supplies. People there were thin in a shape the reports describe as uniform. The occupation authorities worried in memoranda about social disorder. They blocked off train cars to keep city dwellers from going to the countryside in large groups to barter. They called these trips hamster rides. The Germans called them Hamsterfahrten, and the word achieved a kind of bitter cuteness. In these months, cigarettes became more than a vice. Cigarettes became a unit. Americans called them lucky strikes. Germans called them money with ash. There was an exchange rate in the streets large enough to be seen from the windows. A pound of butter. 40 cigarettes. A pair of boots. 100 cigarettes. The mathematics of hunger could be done with the fingers stained brown. Even those who did not smoke learned to flick with the authority of a banker. The Americans smoked and smiled and did not always understand that their breath made budget lines. Karl's sister sold the brooch their mother had saved. She received flour. She bought coal with a bag made from a curtain. They were observers of their own decline into practices that would later be described only obliquely. They took the ring from their father's drawer. They considered it and decided to keep it. They used a bicycle without tires wrapped in rope. They walked alongside. They set aside the idea that respectability precluded haggling on the corner with men who said they were from Poland and who had gold teeth. The oral histories that would be collected decades later by university centers show these details as if they were universal. They are not universal, but they are common. They belong in a list that has become a genre. By 1947, the denazification hearings formalized into a system that wanted to finish. The Sprechkammern convened. Panels sat. Paper was handled. Categories were assigned with the gravity of kindergarten awards and the knowledge that the prizes had to be jobs. The mathematics of guilt narrowed into the arithmetic of identity cards. Who could again sit at a desk? Who could open a shop? Who could enter a practice? Who could teach? Who could be a policeman? The Allied intelligence summaries, now harder to obtain and written in a language more legalistic, detail the numbers. Millions submitted forms. Hundreds of thousands were suspended. A small percentage were named offenders. The rest were named followers or exonerated. This curve is not accidental. It is the graph of a policy intent on stability. The past is a variable that can be adjusted to achieve a new equilibrium. Karl appeared before a panel on 14 March 1947. It was a small room in the former courthouse with a window without glass. A blanket had been hung there. The blanket moved in the draft and gave the hearing a domestic aspect. He had his letters with him, one from a former colleague who had been dismissed in 1933 for refusing to sign a loyalty form, one from a man who had been in a camp and who remembered that Karl had once stamped a visa request quickly, one from a priest. He held them like talismans. The questions were straightforward and cold. When did you join? Why? Did you hold a rank? Did you instruct others? Did you contribute to any organizations? Did you denounce? He answered as others answered. He was a follower. He wanted to keep his job. He had children to feed. He had not wanted trouble. He had not wanted trouble. He had known little. He had known nothing. The Sprüchkammer assigned him to Category 4, Mitläufer, follower. He received a fine. He was suspended for 3 months. He was asked to attend re-education lectures. He did so. He wrote notes. He listened to a man speak about democracy in a tone that was both hopeful and condescending. He thought about the word Ordnung, order, which had been his vocation, and the word Freiheit, freedom, which was not. He decided that they could be added if the sum would be marketable and edible. Many did not return to their desks. Many did. An occupation report from April 1948 lists a resumption rate at the ministries that would become West German ministries. It shows a slow return to old habits with new stationery. The Control Council that oversaw the process had already declared its priorities: no collapse. The mathematics of guilt met the economics of administration in a ledger that the documents do not color-code. The displaced arrived as if there had been a door in the sky. The trains came, and the people on them were Germans, but did not feel like us, the diaries say. They came from East Prussia, from Pomerania, from Silesia, from the Sudetenland. They came with bundles and with stories and with rage. They came with carts and with horses and on foot. They came into towns that were already knocked into their first derivative. The locals said there was no room. The local authorities said there must be room. Karl was moved from the registry office to the housing office because he had a talent for handling papers without letting them cut his fingers. He was given a map of the city with black squares where buildings were still habitable. He was given a list of names. He was told the arithmetic of rooms. It is simple, the arithmetic of rooms, and impossible. 2 families into one 2-room flat. The rooms become numbers and then become arguments. The woman in the back room says that she lived there first. The man from Königsberg says that he had a house with 7 rooms. He says this as if it were relevant, because it is. But it is not an argument that the current arithmetic can refer to. The housing office assigns. It writes letters. It hears appeals. It tries to be fair and fails as a function of scarcity. It is an allocation problem with a hunger index. It is the politics of cold space. The files from these offices have been kept. They have headings and margins that are beautiful for their neutral faith in administration. They say tenants. They say complaints. They say eviction for cause. They say allocations to expellees. The word for expellees becomes formal, vertribini. Then it becomes political. Associations form. They lobby. They demand commemoration. They publish accounts. A politics around loss grows in the cracks of the new buildings. The locals resent the newcomers. The newcomers, the word Heimat appears more frequently in letters. It is a word that means home, but not only. It means a place that exists in the mind and against which present realities will always be compared to their detriment. The arithmetic of this is not just spatial, it is moral. Who has a right to complain louder? The locals whose houses were bombed, the newcomers whose houses now fly another flag. The answer is that both have a right. The essays in the archives show this balanced declarative sentence. They then show the screaming competitions at housing office doors. In the vicinity of Wehrmacht barracks, and later of new bases, DPs lived adjacent to Germans whose war had ended in May 1945. For others, the war did not end. It continued in the form of waiting for repatriation that was dangerous, as in the case of some Soviet citizens, or waiting for visas to Palestine, to the United States, to Argentina. Jews who had survived the camps refused to go back to villages where people had quietly taken their furniture. Their camps had functioning administrations. They held elections. They had police. They published newspapers with headlines like, in translation, "We demand a homeland." Germans read these headlines with mixed emotions: pity, resentment, distance. In Munich, near the tram stop on Leopoldstrasse, Karl saw a group of DPs with armbands, waiting as a group. He had been told not to speak unless necessary. He did not. One man looked at him and then looked away. He saw on his face a mixture of age and youth that had nothing to do with years. The face of someone who has calibrated hope as a survival technique. This is a form of mathematics unteachable in any school Karl had known. The Allies instituted compulsory screenings of atrocity films. They used them as medicine. The medicine came with side effects. People felt sick. People felt humiliated. People felt they were being asked in one dose to take on guilt they had not ordered. The immediate effect was not often reflection, but recoil. German diaries in those months sound staccato. We did not know. How could we know? The rumors were only rumors. We were afraid to ask. The harm that had occurred for years, encapsulated in a captured moment, asked to be understood in a single swallow. Karl found that the January cold penetrated his bones faster than the morality did. He wrote, "What we see slides off while our hands are numb. Will it return when the hands work again?" He did not answer. He went to the office early to warm himself near a heater that hardly did its job. He looked at the list of names of those needing rooms. He saw the names and then the small notes beside them: construction worker, widow, 2 children, expelled from Breslau, former party member, Jewish survivor. The category next to the name was a calculus that would determine the next bed. He made decisions that would grow memory in him like a bruise. In 1948, the American policy changed in a way that ordinary people could taste. The currency reform arrived like a trick. People stood in lines at designated places on 20 June 1948. They received new money, crisp, greenish, with numbers that smelled like possibility. The Deutsche Mark would be the basis of a new story. The reform gave each person a fixed amount initially, then more later, in exchange for their old Reichsmarks at rates designed by committees that looked like math departments. The black market collapsed in a single weekend. Cigarettes returned to being smoked. Shop windows filled as if a convoy had docked in the basement. Karl stood before a shop and stared at jars of jam and was embarrassed by his sudden surge of belief. The Marshall Plan was a phrase that meant ships and warehouses and a foreign language that could be carried. It meant sacks of flour stamped with English words. It meant machines arriving disassembled and being put together in factories that had been swept by the Trümmerfrauen. It meant a truck with a star on it releasing a crate that would become a lathe, which would cut the rods, which would become parts for other machines. The economics of the plan was documented in graphs sent to Washington. The archival voice is precise: X million dollars disbursed, Y% to industrial rebuild, Z% to food. The human voice is imprecise. I saw my first orange since the war. I had milk in my coffee. I bought shoes that were not someone else's shoes. The narratives drop into those small bowls and are enough. In November 1948, there were ration cards still, but their arithmetic had changed. Now the parallel markets were closer to the official. There was a sense that a future had been deployed and that it needed to be defended. The Berlin blockade began in June 1948 and would last until May 1949. It made the Cold War audible. The airlift layered the sound of propellers over a new identity. The numbers are famous and can be found in occupation reports: flights per day, tons per day, numbers of sacks of coal delivered by airplane. The mathematics of flying coal became the mathematics of a political identity. West Berliners waved at planes. The image is crisp in newsreels: children with handkerchiefs, candy dropped on parachutes. The East was not an abstraction. It was a place whose authorities did not like the arithmetic being done by others. For Karl, the Cold War rearranged offices. It rearranged what was important in personnel files. It rearranged who was a risk. It made anti-communism valuable. It made the argument for stability more compelling than the argument for depth and thoroughness in denazification. Men who had been removed came back. They had new words, but old habits. A law in 1951 would be called, in its number, the 131 Law, and it would allow the return of many civil servants who had been dismissed after 1945. The mathematics of guilt now had an amnesty function. The variables could be adjusted in the name of continuity. The files note this not as morality but as fact. Karl moved again. He took a job with a factory that had been partly destroyed and had rebuilt its first hall. It made machine parts for textile looms. The owner had been a party member. He had been categorized as a follower. He had a letter from a priest. He had a political certification that allowed him to run his business. He did not hold meetings now. He did not fly flags. He flew orders. He flew production quotas. He read about the Marshall Plan and wrote about productivity. He hired men who had returned in 1949 from camps in the East. He sent them to the infirmary. They started work 2 weeks later. The arithmetic of work was hard, and it was not always different from before. There was a foreman who shouted. There was a lunch break with soup. There was a wage that crept up. There was a new bulletin board that had slogans. The slogans were different and less mandatory, but still slogans. School books appeared that used clear lines. They taught the German language without its recent ornaments. They taught history with a lacuna. The Nazi period was simplified in vignettes. It was said to be a matter of a few men. It was said to be an emergency. It was said to be opposed by many. It was said to have ended in 1945. The children learned what to repeat. They learned dates and were spared connections. The historian reading these textbooks later will note the erasures more than the inclusions. The mathematics of guilt expressed itself in curricula as the equation: suffering equals bombings plus expulsion plus captivity. The victims of the Germans are absent, or they appear as piles without names in newsreels that do not correspond to homework. The public commemorations in the early 1950s were about the dead in uniform and the dead under rubble. They were about the Heimkehrer, the returned prisoners of war, many of whom returned not in 1945 but in 1955. Political speeches described them as representatives of national endurance, men whose patience carried meaning. The photos are poignant and also political. Gaunt faces under flags of a new state. Behind the speeches was another narrative that was not spoken publicly: memberships in organizations, participation in acts that would not be discussed in 1955, because they were folded into other priorities. Selective memory has an arithmetic too. It adds the numbers that support a story and subtracts the numbers that cannot be digested. In this world, Carl made his life. He married in 1942 and had a daughter in 1944 who survived in a cellar. He had a son in 1948 when there was already milk. He raised them to say please and thank you and to say nothing about some things. He did not tell them when he wrote in his notebook. He did not tell them what he had stamped. He did not tell them what he had seen at Dachau. He told them instead that school was important, that Germany would be different now, that one must not trust men who speak too loudly. He would be silent in a way that allowed certain seeds to germinate on their own. In 1949, the Federal Republic came into being. The Basic Law was enacted. Its name was careful. It is not a constitution, the scholars noted, but for now it is basic law. Its preamble contained an aspiration. Its articles contained protections. In political speeches, democracy sounded like a program. In offices, it sounded like regulations. In factories, it sounded like works councils. The shift from a morally charged situation to an administratively defined one was a strategy and a relief. Bureaucracy makes pasts manageable. It turns them into filing systems. Allied oversight diminished. It did not disappear. In the records of the Allied High Commission, one sees the tempo changing. The reports become quarterly. The adjectives become less ideological and more practical. The Germans are playing politics again, the Americans note. There is bargaining and there is patronage. There are elections. There is the normalcy of power. The 1950s are a montage of concrete and plastic and growth charts. The Wirtschaftswunder is not a miracle. It is the aggregation of production, aided by currency stability, aided by American dollars, aided by eagerness to forget certain debts. The miracle is a story told to make the addition seem transcendent. The addition is this: more cars, more refrigerators, more televisions. The first car you see, you will remember its name. The first refrigerator, you will remember its sound. The first television, you will remember its sound. The effect of consumption was calmer than ideology. It had fewer flags and more useful objects. The housing shortage did not end immediately. The arithmetic of rooms continued through the 1950s. The displaced slowly became residents. The word displaced at first in newspapers acquires quotes. It becomes a political category with demands that appeared to embarrass the new elites. The bundles become wardrobes. The grandmothers who had arrived with pillows die in rooms that still smell of other people's lives. Their grandchildren sound like their neighbors, but carry different maps in their minds. Carl remained at the factory. He became the man who did the timesheets. He depended on legible handwriting until the late 1960s, then on a machine. He was a good man to know if you needed to leave early or if your sick child needed an afternoon that did not count as absence. He liked to smoke 1 cigarette per day and now could afford to. He did not think of it as currency anymore. He thought of it as a marker in time, a ritual that had a beginning and an end. He came to like strong coffee. He came to order his life by the noon whistle. In 1953, the East German uprising made him turn up his radio. He heard words he had heard before: strike, freedom, order, and did not know what he wanted for them. He knew that he did not want the Red Army in Munich. He knew that he did not want to return to a world where his wallet was valueless. He knew that he did not want to hear his son give a speech about anything. He wanted to see his son learn a trade. He wanted to see his daughter be able to use a bank. He saw men from the past return to visibility. One of them became a chief of police. Another became an influential official in the chancellery. The newspapers printed some histories and not others. There were trials at Nuremberg. Then there were other trials. The first had been about the war and its leaders. The second lagged and then trickled. The Cold War allocated attention and resources in directions that had to do with loyalty and not with responsibility. The mathematics of law complicated by the arithmetic of geopolitics. This is a sentence history students memorize late. In Karl's life, it meant that the man who had run his department in 1943 returned to run it in 1952. Karl did not forgive or condemn. He endorsed stability with his presence. He suspected truths without public. He supported a version of order that made his mornings predictable. He watched the mayor's speeches on television and read the newspaper sections on local improvements. He buried his mother in 1956 and was glad the coffin could be carried on a new road. At times, those who had been harmed directly came into his line of sight. A woman whose father had been murdered in 1939 filed a claim with the factory's insurer for a matter unrelated to his death, and in the break room she said the word Auschwitz, and no one replied. The silence had a sound. It was tin and enamel and the scraping of spoons. In a provincial court in 1959, a man from his city testified about an execution that had been a demonstration. It appeared briefly in the newspaper. The headline used passive voice. There were no editorials. There were exceptions to the silence that grew. A prosecutor in Hesse, who carried the law as if it were arithmetic, systematically pursued cases against men who had murdered, not in a frenzy but in departments. When the Auschwitz trial opened in Frankfurt in 1963, the voices in the newspaper could not be as passive because the testimonies were precise. Germans had killed Germans. Germans had killed Poles. Germans had killed Poles. Germans had killed Jews. Germans had killed Roma. Germans had killed Roma. Karl read it and found that the sentence began and ended in him somewhere. His daughter read it and asked questions. He said, "It was before your time." He did not mean to escape. He meant to focus her. He believed that one can be moral only in the present tense. He knew this was also a method. Schoolbooks began to change. New editions had paragraphs on the persecution that were more than paragraphs. The tonality of public life altered in small rooms first. In the 1960s, a lecture he attended at the Volkshochschule used words he had not heard in public before. It said guilt without quotes. It said complicity without volumes being shifted. It drew diagrams that were not about productivity. He wrote in his notebook, "We will be asked to account later. We will answer by listing what we have. We will answer incorrectly." It is easy, in a script like this, to pronounce the new democracy as a compromise and leave it at that. It is more difficult to show the layers without deciding in advance which one is decisive. The markets were freer. The people were more cautious. The government was new, but contained old men. The culture was lively and dull by turns. The economy measured success in exports. The ministries measured success in forms processed. The families measured success in marriages and degrees. The old war wove itself into these measures as a thread that could be ignored in all but the closest readings. Karl kept writing his lines. They were not steady. There was nothing mechanical in his admissions. They arrived when an image cut through. A DP Camp newspaper headline from 1946 he found in a second-hand bookshop. A photograph of a stone in a field in the east, marking something that was not wanted to be marked. A file in his factory's archive that included a letter requesting workers from Poland in 1942. He read these and felt that there was something wrong with the way the afternoon sun lit the tables. He went to work the next day and the light was the same, and the problem did not admit a solution measurable in rays. He joined a mutual aid society. He donated money to a foundation that gave scholarships to children of deported persons. He did not tell anyone. He did not think it would be good to be seen giving in this way. He did not want to be asked. He did not want to be praised. He wanted a ledger that was his. He was suspicious of public piety in an environment where so much had been moralized and weaponized. He wanted, if the language can be pushed, a private arithmetic of atonement. His son grew up without the war. His son's war was held at bay by a border that had become a wall in 1961. That wall was a fact. It sat in the background of every political conversation. It is a simple object. It divides. The moral geometry would be drawn around it for decades. East and west. The mathematical line is visible in aerial photographs. In personal philosophies, it is more complex. One should not make it a straight line. It does not work that way. It bends, and it is bent. In the early 1960s, the wall meant that those who had favored stability could say with authority that they had been right. In that environment, the accounts of the past had less space in the newspaper. They were moved to the weekend editions. Carl aged. He developed a limp that had nothing to do with the war but that looked like it did. An irony. He did not resent it. He used it to slow his pace to the tempo he preferred. He retired from the factory in 1972. He stacked his notebooks on a shelf in a closet. He, at times, took them down and paged through them and felt the friction of the pencil on paper again. He wrote a few more lines. In these later years, new forms of public remembrance appeared. Commemorative stones in courtyards. Plaques that listed names of those taken from schools. These appeared because a generation asked for them. Because the court cases in Frankfurt had put words into print that could not be kept off of walls forever. Because the DPs had long since left, but their absence had turned into an inventory that demanded numbers and names. Because the archives had grown heavy enough to bend wooden shelves. Carl attended a ceremony in 1979 at a school where a plaque revealed 10 names. He did not know those students. He did not know their teachers. He stood and watched a teacher read a few lines from a book. He saw a rabbi. He saw a city official. He saw a wreath. He thought of all the funerals that had not been done. He did not impose his grief onto those absent. He felt only a fixed weight, and with it the knowledge that the mathematics of absence always outruns the mathematics of memorialization. No plaque can catch up with the velocity of loss. It can only mark a point on the curve. It would be easy to have him confess now. To have him tell his children about the stamp and the form and the walls of Dachau. But his sense of life did not work that way. He believed that confession is an offense if it is a transfer of weight in the wrong direction. He believed it is one thing to say, "I saw," another to say, "I could have," and an entirely different moral category to say, "I did." Most Germans permitted themselves the first. Many permitted themselves the second. Few did the third. The mathematics of public confession had 2 decimal places. It did not need to be more precise to satisfy the ledger of immediate social acceptance. It did not need to be less precise to satisfy the need for something like peace. The Bundesarchiv is full of strange moments in the record. A room allocation sheet with a note, applicant cried. A factory file with the phrase, "Laborer requests a Saturday needed for family." An occupation report with the line, "Germans too preoccupied with food to consider democracy." Allied intelligence reports that list the decline of a black market in cigarettes after the currency reform in terms that make the cigarettes feel like a political party. Denazification files, where the panels wrote "follower" with a fatigue one can read 60 years later because the ink knows its own weight in the nib. Carl's notebooks would not be in an archive. They belong to no public record. They are a private treaty with reality. He wrote in their pages sentences that might or might not be moral, but that were honest in the way that craft is. They have the short lines and the expansion. He writes the thesis. He adds the context. He returns again to numbers. He wrote about the phrase 0 hour. He did not like it. He wrote that there is no zero in human time. There is only subtraction and addition. He wrote about the addition of food and houses and wages. He wrote about the subtraction of illusions and excuses. He wrote about tasks and totals. He wrote about the supply of silence and the demand for it. On 12 November 1981, in Munich, he opened his notebook again. He was older. He had survived a surgery and had begun to throw away papers. He made a new entry. He wrote, "Our new city stands on shells made of hollow words. Its foundations are partly concrete, partly bargains. The bargains kept us from each other's throats. They also kept us from our own throats." He meant that the throat had two functions, one for speaking, one for breathing. The bargains had protected the second by restricting the first. He thought of the Trümmerfrauen he had watched 3 decades earlier, of their bodies bent in forms that one could see in photographs and rarely in sculpture. He thought of the DP camp at Feldafing, now long closed, its barracks gone. He thought of the evacuated school building, turned back into a school with children who would learn about the camps and meant it when they asked, "How?" He thought of the housing office and its arithmetic of rooms. He thought of the Spruchkammer and its arithmetic of guilt. He thought of ration cards and their arithmetic of calories. He thought of the Cold War and its arithmetic of planes and votes and loyalties. He thought of all these sums and of the intimations they created and of the remainder that never went away. He had been an ordinary man in a country that needed extraordinary decisions and made ordinary ones instead. He belonged to a city that preferred not to speak aloud, and that later learned to speak aloud, and that later learned to speak in ceremonies. He had seen the occupation and the transition and the trick with money. He had filed forms and watched others file forms. He had overseen timesheets and had been present at the planting of a tree, a memorial that would need 20 years to look like an answer to any question. He did not write about heroes. He did not write about villains. He wrote about systems and how they permitted to be good enough, those who had never been brave and those who had been cowardly only in private. He was, by education and calling, an administrator. He applied the same instinct to his moral life. He wrote one last sentence. He made it like the first, short to cut, and then to be extended by the rest of the pages he would leave behind. He wrote, "We kept the peace by agreeing not to pronounce certain words." Then he expanded. He wrote that those words included names of camps and names of crimes. He wrote that the names changed over time, that some words became sciable, that some became heavy with repetition and lost their edge. He wrote that there were new prohibitions and new necessities. He wrote that the front line was not at the Oder or at the Rhine, but at the desk where a man stamps a form authorizing an allocation. He wrote that the battleground was in the head of a man who has to distribute rooms to people who hate each other for reasons they can and cannot explain. His last line, written in 1984, echoes the first. It was 4 October. The city was quiet. It was the kind of autumn day that makes even concrete seem like fruit. He wrote, "We will rebuild on silence and call it peace, and I have learned that my front line ran through my memory and my paperwork, not across a battlefield.